Welcome to the Generous Business Owner Podcast, where business owners gain inspiration and encouragement to live a legacy, not just leave one. And now your hosts, Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. My name's Jeff Thomas, and as usual, I've got my sidekick and partner in crime, Jeff Rutt, with me. Jeff, say hello to the people.
Hello to the people.
And we do have, of course, a very special guest for you this week. Her name is Becca Spradlin. She is the founder of On Mission Advisors, and she'll tell you all about what that business does. And we all kind of, Jeffy and I do have kind of personal and corporate connections to Becca. And so, but I won't steal the thunder. Jeff, start us off.
Yeah. Thank you, Becca, for joining the podcast today. Looking forward to you sharing with our listeners. Tell us about the early days of what it was like growing up with some of those formative years, entrepreneurial and spiritually. Yeah, any fun stories?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. It's a joy to be with you guys. I'm looking forward to it. So I grew up in a Christian home, really blessed by that. Also blessed to have an older brother that was pretty quintessential older brother, the kind of brother that would leave you under the car and say, figure out how to get that oil filter off so we can change your oil. So it was great having that experience. I think for a lot of us who grow up with entrepreneurial families, we may not appreciate it until we're older. But often I think of like the side hustle, the gig economy as like a millennial thing. But my dad had a side hustle, a side gig. He's a baby boomer, but he had that, and that was kind of normal in our family. So he had a full-time job. He would use his time off to do his side business of tax preparation. And this was in the days where we didn't have the software. So he's like, I have to get 100% on my test every time. That's what he would tell us when we were kids growing up. So, but it was neat too. I mean, as a Christian, he really tried, I don't know how intentionally he tried to integrate his faith, but it just came out. So I remember my mom saying, there was a couple over at the office last night and they're struggling in their marriage. And that kind of stuff comes out when you touch finances, as you guys know. And he tried to encourage them. I think he also just said, I'm going to leave you guys here to work this out. And it was just neat to see how a business tax preparation can become something so important in people's lives. So again, you can take that for granted as a kid, but now as an adult, I'm like, yeah, that was the environment. A lot of entrepreneurs in the family. I would say my entrepreneurial ventures were a lot smaller in scale: babysitting, yard work, snow shoveling. I did get one. I used to paint a lot. So my uncle actually commissioned me. He had some photos and he commissioned me to turn them into poster-sized watercolors. So I would just track my hours, $5 an hour, probably late 90s rate. And I sold 2 paintings to him. So that was a fun thing. I don't think I've sold any paintings since then, but he was pleased with how they turned out. And that was kind of fun to do as a teenager.
Wow, that's awesome. So staying with that is so cool to hear the tax preparation and kind of the counseling that was really caught. That was something that you hear through the book Sticky Faith. There's so much that's caught more than taught, but that definitely shaped you.
Right. Yeah. And it was just interesting because it's not like you go into it thinking like, I'm going to counsel people on their relationships and their family, but it's something that just kind of happens.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it doesn't happen with every tax preparer.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, as a recovering CPA, I'll say the other thing is, and we all face this. I was never really a tax preparer, but on the audit side, there are ethical choices you make with your tax preparation. So it actually, I was just having a discussion this weekend with some people saying, you think I can deduct this thing? And I was like, no, I mean, so the creativity is
Mhm.
good, but anyway, there are some things that can sort of lead to those interesting conversations, actually.
Yes, yes. And you do, as you said, Becca, it leads to finances touches so many different parts
Everything.
of a family, and it opens up conversations. And if you're receptive and truly listening and caring, it puts you in a very a good place to be able to come alongside his
Hey,
family. So that's awesome.
Becca, just out of curiosity, what was your dad's day job?
He worked, that's a good question. He did different things, but he worked for the local government. Yeah.
Okay, okay, all right,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah,
very
great.
good. Okay, keep
So
it
yeah,
going, Jeff. Yeah.
walk us through. So the rest of, just going on to schooling, met your husband, started your
Yeah.
career. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my mom always raised us like there wasn't really anything that was off limits or that we couldn't do. I think a really defining moment for our family, my dad actually ended up passing away my first semester of college
Oh,
suddenly. And so even after that, my mom was really encouraging of us, whether we wanted to do a missions trip, whether we wanted to do, XYZ in school or take more classes or things like that. She was always encouraging us and she prayed for us a lot. And I think, especially as a parent, I'm convicted by that example, things you don't appreciate until you're a parent. Just
True.
that prayerfulness over us. And also just that, I think for my brother and I are, he actually has his own company too. But there wasn't really anything that she said we shouldn't do or that we couldn't do. She really just encouraged us in that. And I think that really just sets your kids up to do all sorts of things, but certainly on an entrepreneurial journey or track that the Lord ended up leading us both on. I think that was part of it. And we both ended up doing multiple missions trips, a couple we did together, which was an act of faith for her as a widow or her only two kids. So I just think God showed up in a lot of different ways in our family, the provision for us after he passed, and then also just getting us through college and into our careers. Um, it's just neat to see that and reflect on that now.
Wow. Yeah, that had to be really spiritually formational during
Absolutely.
that time. And it sounds like your mom really took a leap of faith in not contracting the circle, but expanding the to globally, really.
Absolutely. And you're right. She absolutely could have contracted, and that would have made a lot of sense. No one would have blamed her for that, but she
Right.
really encouraged that in us.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, that probably
think a
shaped you
lot
as
of
well.
it seems like a lot of entrepreneurs also get have some naysayers in their family. A lot of people when you're taking risks will just say, "Are you sure?" Especially if your dad maybe had a government job or something. That sounds like a
Yeah.
little safer
Yes. Very
track, even though he
stable.
had the side gig, and so I think it is a blessing. I'm glad that you pointed that out to have
Yeah.
somebody like your mom encouraging you actually to
Mhm.
kind of take risks in multiple areas. So
Absolutely.
uh,
Yeah.
that's cool. Keep going, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, no, yeah, walk us through, yeah, you growing spiritually,
Yeah.
walk us through that, schooling, met your
Absolutely. So
husband.
I knew I wanted to study business. That was just I don't know. I knew I wanted to work. I wanted to study business. It was just part of how the Lord wired me.
Mm,
I had the opportunity to do submissions in college as well. And entrepreneurship is not only in the business space. Our school let us do student-led missions trips locally and internationally. So when I was 19, I went on a missions trip. When I was 20, I led a team of teenagers to Haiti and did it again the next year. And I think it was the second year, the State Department threat warning like let out the level while we were there. I don't know that they continued that particular trip. I think
mm,
maybe one year and then they kind of no longer offered that. But that was really formative for me just to see the level of poverty there. And as a business major, and a lot of people who end up in microfinance have this story, but you have a business something experience degree, you see poverty like that, and you're like, I need to do something about this. So came back and I was like, I'm going to add in all the international economic classes I can. And I want to do this when I grow up. And I had experience consulting. That was a lot of my internships were in consulting, but then I ended up working at a foundation that focused on promoting economics internationally. and then ended up working at a rating agency that specialized in microfinance. There are not many of those in the world, but I was really blessed to get a job there. And from there, I got to do, organizational assessments of microfinance institutions internationally. We did some research on the funding flows into microfinance, the microfinance investment vehicle. So did some research on that. And in the course of that journey, I got connected to a organization called Hope International, which blended, I know, of all the organizations, blended the gospel with microfinance and savings. And that was kind of new to me. And a failed attempt to try and sell Hope International some of our rating services. What failed from a sales perspective ended up, the very kind individual I was talking to said, I think you should come work here. And I was like, what? We didn't talk about that at all. I was trying to help you understand social ratings and all of that. So anyway, I sent my resume and candidly was like, I live outside of DC. I don't know anyone in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And this was pre-COVID, back in the days when you moved for a job. And I sent my resume, and then all of a sudden I get a call from a 717 area code number, which is the Lancaster area code for those who didn't know. And a guy named Jesse Kassler was cold calling me after seeing my resume. And it was just a long story short, and in a divine kind of sequence of things that only God orchestrates, my husband and I, 2 years into marriage, end up relocating from where we had friends and community and church to a place where we had none, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And then God has just, we still live here, and God's provided us abundantly in so many ways, from relationships to family moving here, as Lancaster tends to do. Is just a great place to live. So we've really enjoyed it now over 10 years ago, which is wild to think.
How did that happen?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. And for those of you who don't know, Jesse Kassler is he's been here 20 years. He's kind of the silent, kind of the guy behind the curtain that makes everything happen at Hope International. And if you get a call from Jesse, that's a good day. Right, Becca?
Pick up that call.
Yeah.
I think I let it go to voicemail because I really had no idea who it was. It worked out okay. He was very gracious, and we ended up connecting.
Yeah. Well, you obviously contributed immensely to the work of Hope International while you were here. And then tell us about how some of the things that you connected with here ended up leading you into what you do now.
Right. And again, starting a consulting practice was not on my 1 year, 5 year, 10-year plan. But right around the time I joined Hope, a book that you all are familiar with called Mission Drift got published. And given my background at a rating agency, I remember being asked, could you create an assessment to help us know, and as Peter says, not if, but where we're drifting, because drift is the natural course. Mm-hmm. Where are we drifting? So actually back in 2014, we started piloting these assessments in different countries, different places, to discern where are we drifting? What does it look like? What would indicators be? And within a year, someone on the board, Chris Crane, who helped found Edify, said, hey, can you come do that assessment for Edify, a much younger organization? And we actually have been doing assessments for Edify ever since 2015. Inside of Hope, we set up a team to help us do this, among other things, to really keep a pulse on where drift is happening, both from an assessment side, but also from an encouragement, sharing best practices too. So I feel like for 8.5 years, I got to learn so much from the leadership team of Hope. And then really the consulting On Mission does now grew out of the demand that came from the book that Peter and Chris wrote, Mission Drift, and trying to serve people, whether it's workshops, whether it's helping them discern their guidance and guardrails, kind of their North Star like policies, like discerning what is drift, what isn't, because it's not the same for every organization. So everything we do, from helping you refine your mission, vision, values, to setting up those North Star policies, like guidance for your organization, to strategy design and governance, it's all with a lens of understanding what's your mission and how do we avoid drifting from it today and then for generations to come.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. I'm going to turn this over to Jeff, but before we do, we'll put some more information in the show notes. But we mentioned Peter a couple times. That's Peter Greer. He's the president and CEO of Hope International, and we'll put a link to the book Mission
Absolutely.
Drift, which has been extremely popular and he's spent a lot of time with boards all over the country, all over the world. But you're right. It's not a matter of if you're drifting; it's in what areas and how much. But
Yeah.
thank you, Becca, for your work in this space and kind of extending and leveraging, those
Yeah.
that original work.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And thanks for being a part of it too.
Well, I mean, I think Peter, in that book, and his partner, you know, it's kind of the seminal book. I think I don't know of another book. I'm sure there are other books, maybe tangentially, but that's the one I think of that kind of named this thing that we've all witnessed. And not to pick on poor Harvard or some other organizations, but I think there's a lot of big sort of famous colleges, I think, that have been around for over 100 years, or maybe founded on Christian principles, but I mean, definitely drifted, right?
Right.
And so what are some of the examples that you use, Becca, for mission drift generally?
Yeah, so I think something we learned along the way, I had the opportunity to do a research fellowship with Seattle Pacific University about a year ago. And something I was really curious about is that mission drift happens. It happens in every nonprofit. Peter's book really highlighted how Christian organizations will lose that Christian component, that faith component of what they do. The pull is away from that. That absolutely happens too. But we also see this in businesses. So the book Mission Drift is really focused on the nonprofit case, and there are tons of nonprofit cases, as you know, higher education being one, but so many other ministries, churches. It's a crisis, as the book shares. But I was really interested in looking at it from businesses, so for-profit entities that actually do the hard work of integrating their faith in some way, honoring God in some way. How do they keep that going over time? And what factors lead them to drift and what helps them avoid it? So, what started as this research fellowship connected, kind of snowballed into a lot of interviews with other organizations and turned into a book. So, the book Lead on Missions coming out, this is really the business side of that story of Peter's book being nonprofit focused. This is really about how do businesses A, integrate their faith, and B, push it out beyond themselves. What are they doing? What techniques are they using? And how are they avoiding drift? So one of the key case studies that got me into this was a case study we studied in the fellowship, which is the Service Master Company. Everyone's kind of familiar with that. Younger generations may not know that this company was really founded to honor God in the marketplace. And that was front and center for decades. After going public, still there. You can still go to some franchises today and still see to honor God and everything we do on the wall. But corporately, that is not the message that happens. And I had the pleasure of interviewing different people who worked there. And I think one of the striking things was so many leaders, like you think of Greg Leith, who leads Convene today, and so many others, they worked at Service Master. Service Master churned out a number of leaders who now serve and are using their leadership giftings and carrying on that mantle of servant leadership in other places. But unfortunately, that's not that didn't stay within Service Master. So the book really explores A, how did it happen? Even after going public, they stayed with it for a while. So it wasn't just going public, there were other things, right? Um, and so we try to kind of tease out the factors in that case study and so many others that kind of get to what causes drift and how do we then avoid it. So the first half kind of goes through the cautionary tales, and the second half has case studies. Every chapter has case studies trying to illuminate what can we learn from these businesses that integrated faith, that lost their faith over time. What are the practical applications we can take and consider in our own businesses?
So and I think maybe we skipped a little piece here. Tell us about your transition out of Hope and into starting your own business to help companies, kind of a consulting business that helps
Sure.
companies think about how to avoid this mission drift. Tell us about that process of setting
Sure,
up your own
sure.
company.
Yeah, and Jeff, you can share your your vantage point of this story. It was interesting because within Hope, we were doing these things within Hope, and then as people would ask, the book, they approached Peter, anything that wasn't like a speaking engagement, we would do because we were Hope, says it's rooting for rivals, open-handed, and we were open-handed with our time. So we would go and do workshops for nonprofits, for profits, locally. We'd fly. We'd do self-assessments for others. And I'm not, a great development rep. I would say, please, maybe make a donation to Hope for our time or something. We never asked for payment or anything. And it got to the point where I'm like, Peter, I think there actually is enough. This problem is real. The book raised the problem. And so what can we do about we can kind of passively respond, but I think even there's this like a proactive, approach we could, flag we could fly there and see what happens. And it was just kind of discern. I'm pretty sure Peter took it up to the board. So I don't know, Jeff, if you remember that conversation,
Yes.
but it was
Mm.
kind of discerned like, this isn't microfinance, which is very, very true. It wasn't microfinance. It was consulting.
Mm.
Um, so, I mean, and now people joke like, haha, it was mission driven. I'm like, yes, I guess programmatically speaking,
Mission drift is what.
programmatically speaking, not
Okay,
a
that's
faith
funny.
mission drift, but programmatically could have veered us in a different direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I go back one more step or maybe a side step? Because
Sure.
I think this leads to a future question. But Becca, tell us a little bit about how you met your husband. Tell us about your three beautiful girls, and tell us about and maybe you can tie this in with a few in the next few minutes sometime. But
Yeah.
how generosity, holistic generosity, and some of passing on the faith and values and generosity to that next generation looks for you and your season of life.
Yeah, absolutely. So my husband and I both ended up in the Northern Virginia, DC metro area after school. And we actually met when our small group leaders, so his small group leader, his men's group, mine and my women's group, they got married. So we met at their wedding. And so we kind of just, I think I tried to send him a friend request on Facebook, but internet wasn't great. So it never made it through. And, it was just one of those, after a couple months, we reconnected and I was I enjoy running and I was really into running at the time. And I remember one point where I said, one of your friends asked me to go running. Would you like to come with us? One of his guy friends. Ended up me and three guys going trail running, which is not something I did often. So, or ever. 20 paces in, I bit it hard and I fell and I won't be graphic, but my knee split open.
Oh,
And I ended up kind of while I was like, let's keep going. I've fallen before, the adrenaline I'm gonna be sore. Let's just get. They looked at me like, I think we need to go to the hospital. I was like, don't take me to the hospital. I don't want to go there. It's gonna be painful. I ended up walking to back to the parking lot and then kind of slumped over on the curb. And I remember just being carried into the car.
oh my gosh.
We go into triage of course, the nurse is like, so what's the relationship here? I'm like, and I'm just kind of like, I'm not quite all there at the point. And he's like, we're just friends and da, 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 of course. And he's thinking like, I like her, but I haven't told her. And I'm thinking she just needs to know that we're not related in case I need a blood transfusion or something. Ended up getting a bunch of stitches. They said they lost count. His side of the story is like, I could actually see your bone. So that's why we took you to the hospital. Like, okay. Interestingly, the night before this happened, I prayed to God for two things and I journaled it. I prayed for humility and more time with this guy named Phil. So
Careful what you pray for, right?
I have not prayed for humility since then, and I've not been back to the ER. So anyway, we ended up making it official shortly thereafter. My roommates joked that when I was like on drugs and heavy medication for the knee injury, we ended up getting married and moved up here to Lancaster, and the Lord blessed us with three precious girls. And so now the conversations and the journey is a whole lot different. Still tears. We have a lot of tears. But we often find ourselves saying, Lord, we do not know how to parent. Please help us. So anyway, it's a joy, and it's sweet to see the Lord speak to them and work through them, whether it's through generosity or just what they're learning, just experiencing the word of God through their eyes and feeling like the Lord speaks to us sometimes through them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know we're going to ask, sorry, I promise I'm going to go on mute, Jeff Thomas, after this question, but I would love to know, Becca, what, like, if you have one or two things, because you've obviously thought about this, for other families in this season of how they're impacting and influencing, and maybe it's through sticky faith or just stickiness
Yeah.
of that, that those three girls.
Right. I do think back to what you shared earlier, like the caught and taught. Yeah, I think you
Yeah.
kind of want to do both.
Yeah.
So when I think back to my childhood, I remember seeing my dad reading the Bible. I remember seeing my mom reading the Bible and leading Bible study groups, being in Bible study groups, being at church, not in a legalistic way.
Mhm.
That was just kind of how we grew up. So I think it's really important for them to see us in the word, and it's
Mhm.
really encouraging as they start to learn to read to see them in the word. And we try to do some Bible time at night. We try to let them lead Bible time, which is honestly an act of perseverance a lot of times.
Yeah.
But we try. And I think I'm like encouraging generosity. I think we try to mix it with helping them understand what's going on in the world. And when they say things like, I think we should give money there, okay, let's do that. And we use digital. Everything's pretty much digital. So my husband will be like, now you hit the button, something simple like that. I think too early on, I was like, I don't know. I don't want to give them an allowance for doing nothing, but having them like work for money that they can then have and give.
Mhm.
It's been
Mhm.
really sweet. I know sometimes one of my daughters got like a $10 bill for her birthday. My kids are younger, and she put the whole thing in offering, and I was just like, "Whoa." Like, I can't make her do that, nor would I have asked her to
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that, but when I saw it, I was like, "That's so
That
beautiful."
is beautiful. So how old was she?
I mean, she's 6 now, she might have been 5,
Yeah. Yeah. You
It just
cannot, yeah, such an impressionable, formidable age. And that's coming straight from the heart. Wow.
right.
That is amazing.
I think what we're
Yeah,
talking about is avoiding mission drift in our families.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and that's like a daily conversation, right? Because so often, even now, my husband and I are in the midst of like, what fall activities are we going to do or not do? And that takes time away from being present with neighbors, doing other things with church. So how do we, kind of form that holistic thing? We did try to form like family kind of like mission and values. Um, like we did it, and then I did like a Bill High workshop where, I mean, what we had was way too long. It wasn't memorable. So we really like trimmed it down to make it simple. And we've had 3 family meetings. I don't know if that what qualifies as a family meeting, but the first one was really aided by M&Ms and
Yeah.
trail mix. Once they figured out each part of our meeting agenda, which was like a poster board, was an M&M or some trail mix, they got into it. They figured it out. And it's sweet even now because I leave the board out. It's this ugly board, but I let it sit out. And they're like, are we going to do a family meeting now? And we did the last one without any chocolate. And I was shocked.
Oh, oh, great.
And we
Yeah.
did it. I mean, we try to keep it to 15 minutes or less. So these are not like maybe the normal, what I was thinking family meetings were like. But again, my kids are 9, 6, and almost 4. So we try to, cater to the audience.
That's awesome. So awesome.
So let's switch over to professionally, because this is really important what you're doing. I don't know anybody else on the planet doing what you're doing, which is helping companies draft this sort of North Star document. I know you've done it for Arcos, our company, and it was just a wonderful process. But can you describe, and I know you do, that was maybe a smaller engagement. I know you do other consulting and you'll get with
Sure.
boards of directors, but take us through what the business does.
Sure. And I'll say I am, as a person, I'm not interested in reinventing the wheel. If someone else does something, especially coming from a place like Hope that's very open-handed, it's like, how can I help you do that? I just in all of our work, kind of like freely consulting for others,
Yeah.
I just wasn't seeing anyone else doing this, or certainly not doing it in this way. And um, so there's a couple of things we do. I think for any organization, though, it starts with your core. So we target the inner circle. It's what is your mission, your higher purpose. Even your values might evolve over time, but what's core? What maybe we restate it differently, but that is what this company, this organization is about. Once you have clarity on that, which a lot of companies don't, you can kind of move what we call to the outer ring. And I call this our North Star kind of guidance and guardrails, because we don't want to, drift. You often think of like anchor. I'm like, I don't want to anchor any organization. I don't want to be anchored. We want people having that kind of point of truth and moving toward the vision the Lord's calling them to. So we don't define what your mission is for an organization. We want to help them discern that with the Lord. That's critical. But the guidance and guardrails piece, so often organizations have not defined, well, if I were to ask your leadership team, your board of directors, well, what's mission drift for us? They could give some ideas, but depending on the organization, there's going to be more unity around what comes out of that conversation, or less, or a wider spectrum. And we dig into, hard issues like, who do we permit to be owners of this organization, or what type of board members are we recruiting? Where do we get funding from for the nonprofits? Are there funding sources we won't go to, or as a business, are there places, charities we won't give to? How do we actually create space to dig into all those kind of hot button issues, but do so from not the issue level, kind of from a higher principle level? These are the principles we want to operate as an organization. And downstream, that means, XYZ policies. Again, guidance and guardrails. We don't want to unnecessarily handcuff any organization, because we want them to change and innovate. That's how they stay relevant. But what are some kind of perimeters of play, so to speak, and we kind of force the innovation within that, to really go deeper with the mission, to have greater eternal impact, more so than we even have today, and in contexts that we can't imagine today.
Well, the
So
story just popped into my brain, Becca. Thanks for sharing the overview. And I know we want to dig in more, but Jeff, I was just thinking about, you and I were just at the gathering, and one of the breakout sessions that I attended, I don't know if you were at that one, Jeff, but was just a family talking about their father had become a believer later in life.
Yeah.
I'd
Plain
left
tops.
a lot
Yeah.
of the money to his foundation
Mhm.
and gave very limited instructions. And so
mhm.
a lot of the discussion was from his son and daughter saying, I wish we had more written down to follow. It
Mhm.
would have made our job a lot easier. And so I think it's the same thing. That was my feeling. It's like, I know I talk about these things at our company a lot,
Yeah.
but it's not all written down. And I wrote a book about the story and that sort of thing of the formation, but it's a much more detailed. I can see that document, that North Star document, living, God willing, for 100 years. Not trying to control everybody from the grave, but missionally,
Right.
staying aligned, and all of these things written down, things that I didn't know how to write them. So to get
Right.
unity with the team, and then to write them down so that people 90 years from now, when I'm long gone, can read those things.
Mhm.
There's some, if it's not written down, it's subject to more interpretation.
Yeah.
So maybe
Absolutely.
talk about the value of writing things down.
Absolutely. Well, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I found myself, and before we do a lot of our on-sites for the North Star, we do surveys ahead of time. So I know where the leadership team stands and where the board stands. And I knew the board was on a spectrum for different issues. So we went into it, and uh, it was, I think, at the end of our first day, going into kind of defining policies. What is drift for this organization? And one of the board members said, is the gospel central to what we do? And he asked it in a very flat way that you couldn't tell what he was thinking. And I think it was the chair asked this question, and the room fell silent.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me as a facilitator, I'm thinking, if we don't have clarity on this is an upstream issue. We cannot proceed downstream and clarify these things. So thankfully, I could pull up the bylaws. Now, granted, I had given pre-reads. So the bylaws were in the pre-reads. Everyone, in theory, most of them could have read it ahead of time. But the bylaws made it super clear that, this is about Jesus. We actually had a video from one of the co-founders who is no longer involved in the day-to-day. This is like a 30 or 40-year-old organization. But she was saying, this is about Jesus. This started about Jesus. And so after we went through their bylaws, I even went through some scripture with them. The same kind of the board chair stood up and said, well, it looks like the question is answered here for us. And I think that in a nutshell is how many months would they have spent debating? Is it central? Isn't it central? How central it is? What does it mean? And then you start thinking of the cost of things instead of what has the Lord called us to do and what is the mission we are stewarding going forward. So you want to make sure you're having the right conversation, especially when you go into this. It's like, it's not about the pain and the issues downstream. It's about upstream. What has the Lord called us to do and how are we going to do it given the circumstances we're in? So that's a great example you shared because it's like save the leaders after you, the board members after you, save them the time by making it clear and save them the fights and honestly the tension and the conflict over it by making it clear. Because if it's written, then you can recruit to that. You send that to the next board, you share your
Exactly.
North Star. And so now we see same organization years later, helping them kind of look at it again. New board members saying, I'm so glad they invested in this. Because for me, I know exactly where they stand and I know what I'm getting into. And so you're going to get better board members, which again, will just help you perpetuate that mission going forward.
Yeah. And I think what you said is so true at the top, which and I know you quoted Peter Greer on that, who co-authored the book, but and Jeff, you echoed it. I don't I never thought of it as it's the default, but it is drift is the default.
Yeah.
Like I've been in this our industry for a long time, so capital sources, people who want to invest in the business appear often, shall we say.
Yeah.
And so being able to have a screen for what are the kind of people you will engage in, even with capital or board members or employees, and at what point do they have to be believers or not be believers?
Right.
There's a lot of those discussions that you have, but to me, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. I mean, that's literally one of our principles is have a written plan. So in this case, if you don't have it written down, you will drift. The
Right.
only question is how far and how fast. And one of the
Absolutely.
things I saw that was really interesting is you also define what is not drift. Can you talk about that a little
Yes.
bit?
Yeah, I think this is really important because again, I always kind of give this public service announcement. I'm not opposed to innovation and change. In fact, you need
Yeah.
to do that. And unfortunately, their organizations, whether it's written or not, sometimes they confuse, we call them structures, the things that support the core. So this is the core, you got the things that support the core. Those are not core. You will need to change your structures over time. So your rhythms, maybe some of your policies,
Yeah.
the way you engage staff in faith, you do different offerings because these offerings aren't working. People aren't interested in these anymore. They're not coming, or how you engage in volunteering or giving. These things, these might be tools in your toolkit, but you change them up over time. So I think defining what isn't drift is just as important to make sure people know we're not saying all of this, is off the table, but we've done that kind of extra layer of saying, yeah, these are things that are kind of off the table, but these are things we expect to change. So let's not make a headache for someone in the future either by saying, yeah, these things are not untouchable. You can change these things, and we expect that you will.
Love it. Love it. Well, as we kind of drive toward the close here, Becca, as you always know, as you know from the podcast, we always try to ask for a practical tip. For somebody behind you on the journey, they're running on the treadmill and they're listening to this and they're saying, "Oh boy, I think, or maybe our organization is starting to drift a little bit. Maybe I should start writing a little something down about this."
Sure.
What's a practical tip for them on how to get started to maybe crafting something written that could help their organization not drift?
Absolutely. Well, I think the pre-step is certainly prayer and engaging in faith, because I think what I realized, the model that the framework we use is define, protect, champion.
Hmm.
So defining, certainly making sure you have a clear core, but also defining what is drift, what isn't drift. That's something you could do in an afternoon and share with advisors. And, protecting or getting into the bylaws, the manuals, the other written artifacts, championing culture, people, hiring, leadership development and succession. All those things, that was kind of the model we were using. And I realized what's missing here, and it's the abiding. The leader's own abiding is critical for this.
Yes.
And so that's the outer ring of our model. It is really critical for the leaders to be discerning from the Lord, because we're clear we don't go in and tell you how to define drift, not drift. We lead you through the process that helps come up, with the guidance and guardrails and whatever we're working on. But they need to be connected to the vine. And so that's critical. And that's the starting point. That's where you get the wisdom and insight on everything from business strategy and product development to how to define and set those kind of guidance and guardrails too. So that is a big encouragement that we encourage leaders toward. And then the practical steps is where we step in. That's what we help them with.
I love it. Well, we'll put a link to the show note in the show notes to your company and to the book when it comes out. I know hopefully by the time this is released, it'll be out.
Yep.
And I just what is there another way people can find you? What's the best way for folks to find you?
Sure. So the company is On Mission Advisors. So you can go to onmissionadvisors.com. And then the book is Lead on Mission. So you can go to leadonmissionbook.com and get information on both of those.
Perfect. Well, Becca, I can't thank you enough for joining us on this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast.
My pleasure. So great to be with you.
All right. And thanks, everybody, for listening. Share it with a friend. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Generous Business Owner Podcast with Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt. Make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can find the guest contact information in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode.